Hey guys, welcome back to the Compass Games Learn to Play series. Today we welcome designer Mike Wilner, who is going to walk us through several rounds of card play of his new design, Prelude to Revolution. This is an interesting strategy game that card-driven game fans will be sure to enjoy. So without further ado, over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Mo, and welcome to Prelude to Revolution. It's a two-player card-driven game that is based on the Prelude system. It's the second game in the Prelude system, the first being Prelude to Rebellion, which modeled the unrest and rebellion in Lower Canada in the 1830s. And this game covers the years that led up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. So, like many card-driven games, it has several decks of cards. It depends on us being able to balance our play against the number of areas on the board and keep track of a various scoring and game tracks that will have a very profound impact in the game. There's some really unique mechanics in the game, which I'd like to introduce you to and give you a good idea how to play so you can start either preserving the Romanov dynasty or claiming victory for the revolution, whichever suits you best. So let's start off by taking a look at the board. The fundamental component on the board, as you can see, these areas are called districts. So let's take a close look at one district. For example, the Reserve Regiment Barracks, which is off on the left. What you see here is each player, red for the revolutionary, blue for the government, has a set of boxes where players play cards or pay action points to place cubes. The player with more cubes in an area controls that area. So, for example, in the setup, the revolutionary controls the reserve regiment barracks. Now, that's not meant to say that they could issue military orders to that regiment, but this is more of a hearts and minds political leaning and sentiment is what control represents here. You'll notice on the sides of the tracks where you put the cubes, there's little plus ones and plus twos. That represents additional cost to place cubes in those areas. So if, for example, in the reserve regiment barracks, you'll see every single placement has extra costs for the government, where very few have extra cost for the revolutionary. That further models the revolutionary leaning of this area. So if you want to contrast, have a look at Winter Palace, which is two areas over, where you see the government pays almost no extra costs except for the very last one on top, whereas the revolutionary pays extra cost for each placement. So controlling these areas can yield victory points, and we'll talk more about scoring later. You'll also notice that these areas have connections. You'll see the arrow connecting Winter Palace and Reserve Regiment Barracks. The result is if a player controls an area which the arrow starts in, they get to exert a beneficial influence or dice roll modifier in the influenced area. So, for example, if the government controls the Winter Palace, which it does, then if it's doing any activities in the reserve regiment, like trying to organize the soldiers or things like that, they'll get a positive or beneficial dice roll modifier, or their opponent will get a negative dice roll modifier. So in this way, not only are we playing for control of these districts, but we're also looking to make sure we control strategic districts. For example, you see the Winter Palace is connected to 3 different areas. That's a lot. In the lower left corner, you'll see Vasilyevsky Island, also connected to 3 other areas. Most areas are only connected to 1, maybe 2. So this creates some strategic thinking on the part of the players where they may choose to play in these areas to exert control elsewhere. Another area on the board is the Duma in the top center. This is the political arena of the game. This is where each player has 2 political parties in their faction. The revolutionary has the socialists and the radicals, as you see on the left, and the government has liberals and monarchists, as you see on the right. The game has a concept of moderate or extremist parties. So the socialists are moderates, so are the liberals. The radicals are extremists, so are the monarchists. This has a lot of implications in gameplay, which we can talk about later. But players will vie for majority and dominance in the Duma. Additionally, there are some other effects that are quite important, and you can wind up getting quite a few victory points. Other parts of the board, let's go from left to right. We'll start with the Revolutionary Unrest track all the way on the left. This track starts at 0. As you can see, the little marker is on the bottom at 0. Every turn it will increase 1 automatically, and there are plenty of cards that increase it. I don't know, even 1 or 2 cards that can decrease it, very few. As it works its way up, there's a harmful dice roll modifier that can affect the revolutionary. Harmful in the fact that it strengthens their extremists and causes the radical party to gather more power, which can cost you victory points in the end. If this revolutionary unrest track reaches 15, the very top, it triggers Red October, which ends the game and has a scoring sequence where there's quite a bit of variability, and players can prepare in order to score better in Red October or put their opponents at a disadvantage in Red October. The Tsar's Prestige is the next track over. This represents the Tsar's ability to influence affairs in politics and socially. It starts off on 7. If it decreases, when there are plenty of cards that cause it to decrease, we'll see them later, the Tsar will abdicate. And that's an event where the decks of cards will change, the nature and composition of the Duma will change, and the game will continue, but in a very changed state. If, on the other hand, the Tsar's prestige gets too high, if it creeps up to 15, and there are cards that will drive it up automatically, and there's cards that will drive it up by events, the game ends with both players losing. And the assumption here is the Tsar got so popular that he reimposes autocracy, hangs or exiles all the revolutionaries, dissolves the Duma, and the Romanovs rule for another 300 years. So what these tracks tend to do for the players, and what you as a player need to do, is keep an eye on them, because there are game ending and game altering events that occur as a result of the tracks. And I've seen plenty of games where players are doing great and then they glance over to Red October and say, oh no, it's happening. Or where one player is winning by a lot and the other player simply pushes up the Tsar's prestige to force a mutual loss. So keep your eye on those tracks. The box above it is military preparations. It starts off with 4 victory points worth of loyal troops in favor of the government. This box can have more loyal troops added for the government or red guards added for the revolutionary, and over the course of the game by card play and events. If there is a Red October event, then these victory points are counted up. If there's no event, they don't count. So the player who is planning for a Red October event can push victory points into that area. Over on the right side, we have our scoring tracks. Unlike a lot of these card games where scoring comes as a surprise, a player plays a scoring card out of their hand. In the Prelude system, the scoring is out in the open. There's, as you can see, if we can look at the district scoring track, for example, there's the scoring track up here and then the victory point track down below. The victory point track keeps track of how many areas each player controls. So in this case, the revolutionary controls starts by controlling more than the government. And as we play the game, this track above will advance, the one that says DI score. It'll move to the right a tick at a time, a box at a time. And when it hits that box that says score, we go through a scoring sequence. So what you'll see in the game often enough is these various scoring tracks are on the verge of scoring or far from scoring, and you could model your strategy knowing what's the next thing most likely to score. We'll talk about how the scoring takes place as we go through a sample turn. On the bottom, we see a couple of tracks. We have victory point tracks. That's pretty obvious. It's a net zero game, meaning one player or the other has victory points. And so if the revolutionary has 10 points and the government gets 3, we simply move the revolutionaries back by 3 to 7 points. The game turn track you'll see is divided into 3 eras: Years of Turmoil, Great War, and the Collapse. We'll see in a moment that each of these eras has its own deck of cards and has its own characteristics, as you'll learn as you play. Below that is the opportunity points track. These are points each player gets every turn. They can be spent in a variety of ways. They can be spent to buy cards to play, or they can be spent to improve die rolls when you're doing other game mechanics. There's a limited number, they're very valuable. So that's the board components. I'd like to now share with you the playing cards, which I think is the heart of the game. Let's start off with the event decks. As you can see, there are 3 decks of cards: the Years of Turmoil, the Great War, and the Collapse. This extra deck we'll talk about in a second. When we start the first set of turns in the Years of Turmoil, which is roughly intended to be around 1905 to 1913, we will play off of this deck. It has some general events and general themes, but it has some very specific events to that period of time. Then when we go into the next period, which is the Great War, we'll discard all the Turmoil decks and cards and now deal out of the Great War deck and so on down the line. The cards should be pretty familiar to most card-driven game players, but let me show you in detail. First, in the top center, you see the little double eagle. That's the symbol of ownership. This is a government card. It's got a bluish header, and it's got the imperial signet in the center. So that card is affiliated with the government side. Next to that, on the right, you'll see that it says the Great War, which lets us know which era the card belongs to, and 6 AP. Like a lot of these card-driven games, when you play the card, you can use it for the event or for the action points. And this one is worth 6 action points. Cards generally are 2, 4, or 6 points in value. So 6 is the most. To the left of the eagle there, you see a box with an O in it. That O stands for organization, and that means after we play this card, we're going to roll a die that's going to move one of those scoring tracks, one of the 4 scoring tracks. This one will have the die we roll will favor organizations, and we'll take a look at the scoring die in a minute, but there's no guarantee that organizations is going to move. However, when you play your cards, and let me take this away for a moment, as you can see from the other 2 cards here, this one will move the districts, DI, or roll the district die, which are likely to move the districts. This one will move WA, or World Affairs. So depending on the card you play, that will drive a certain likelihood of scoring. So again, this is a government card. It is of the Great War era, and it's worth 6 action points. It will roll this organization scoring die. Moving down, you see imposition of military discipline. That's the title. And below is the event text, which we have 2 parts here. The first part is bolded, and that says the monarchist party organization has been created. That's the prerequisite. This particular card cannot be played for an event unless a party organization, which I'll explain in a moment, has been created. And below is the instructions for the event. And this one wants you to do what's called a mobilization check, and et cetera, et cetera. And on the very bottom is some historical or commentary or information. This is the anatomy of a card. It'll have an owner, it'll be of a certain era, it'll be worth a certain amount of action points, it'll trigger a certain scoring die, it'll have an event to do, and it may have a prerequisite. As you can see, for example, this is a revolutionary card. It's from the Great War. It's worth 2 action points. It will roll the district scoring die, and it has no prerequisite. So when it gets played, you'll add 3 cubes to the Kronstadt naval base area. And the third type of card is neutral. As you can see, it has both a revolutionary star and an imperial eagle. So either player can play it. And like other cards, it shows you what era it's from, how many action points it's worth, what the scoring die is. It's got a title. And in this case, the player who plays it will do this event, and in some cases it'll say remove, like here it says remove 2 cubes from any district, so that can be anywhere on the board. And then it says your opponent performs a growing extremism roll with an additional +1 on the roll should you roll a 6 on the table. If you're the revolutionary, that means the government does it. If you're the government, it means the revolutionary does it. So they're kind of neutral in the middle. They can benefit or hurt either player. The last thing I want to show about the cards is there's a special deck called the Provisional Government deck that's over here all the way on the right. I have a Provisional Government card out. These cards come into play only if the Tsar abdicates. That is, when the Tsar's prestige track reaches 0, these cards get shuffled into the deck and put into play. And they're specific to the period of time after the abdication, but be up to the point what we call the Bolshevik takeover in October 1917. The rest of the card mechanics are the same. There's a title, there's sometimes a prerequisite, and there's an event. The only other thing I'll point out is on this card, another round of conscription, in the lower left corner, you see the triangle star. That indicates this card will be removed from play should the Tsar abdicate. So that provisional government deck basically will either replace or add to the existing deck, but some stuff comes out. There are some events which just will not make any sense if the Tsar is not in power. So that's the card decks. There's some other nuances on how to play the card, but we'll talk about that when we go through a sample turn. The last thing I want to show you before we get going on a sample turns is the key events. These are a little bit different types of cards. First of all, they are, as you can see, it's structured very similar. It's got the ownership mark in the center. So the Imperial Eagle, this is a government card. It tells us what scoring dice to roll, the O organization, that's worth 2 AP. But you see it says early turmoil. That's because the key event cards don't get shuffled into a deck. They automatically get placed in what's called the opportunity pool on the turn indicated. So for example, this one is placed in play during the early turmoil. If you look down on the bottom, you will see that the years of turmoil is divided into early and late. Great War is divided into early and late. The collapse is divided into February, July, and October. So if we look at the key events deck, you'll see each of these cards in the upper right has one of those specific turns that comes into play in the opportunity pool. Peter Stolypin will come into play in the early turmoil era. Grigory Rasputin will come into play in the early Great War era. And Lenin will come into play in February 1917, which is the first turn in the collapse era. The idea here is that these cards are available for play. They are placed in what's called the opportunity pool, which we will see in the playthrough we're going to do. And if one of the players wants to, if they can play these cards from the opportunity pool. So for example, the war card will go into play during the early Great War period, and it is a government card. So basically, the government has the option to spend 2 action points and play the war card and enter World War One. Doesn't have to happen. It's an option. So there's a bunch of what if type of scenarios that can evolve in this game. I've seen enough games where the Great War never starts, or at least Russia never enters the Great War, where the Tsar never abdicates, or the Tsar abdicates in the first year of the Great War. These represent optional plays for the players, and that makes it quite interesting because you never know who's going to spring one. So that's the card play. I'd like to move on to showing some of the specialized pieces and explaining a little bit more about what we call organizations and that they're an important aspect. And we'll do it by approaching it from a scoring perspective. As you can see, there are 4 scoring tracks: districts, organizations, world affairs, and Duma. Each of those scoring tracks has its corresponding scoring die. So, for example, the district scoring die is a special die that has DI on 3 of its faces. On the other 3 faces, you have one each of the other areas, O, WA, and D. That means when you roll that die, there's a 3 of 6 chance that districts will come up. So 50%. But there's still a chance that organizations, world affairs, or Duma will come up. When I would roll the districts die, and let's say districts does come up, this track will advance one. And then every time a card plays, by the way, one of these tracks is going to advance based on what the die roll comes up. And each time districts gets rolled, this scoring piece will move forward, and finally, when it reaches this point, the district's track will score. And what that means is we'll count up, we've been keeping track of how many districts people control on this track below, the control track. And that tells us as of now, the revolutionary has 6 more districts under control than the government. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that is worth 3 victory points. So when this gets scored, the revolutionary would score 3 victory points. This would reset, and then this track will start advancing again. The typical strategy for the revolutionary player is to play heavily into the districts because there's quite a few points they can get out of it. And there are more cards that give the revolutionary advantages in the district than give the government because they're appealing to the people. The next track down is called organizations. This measures how many organizations have been placed on the board by each player. What's an organization? Each district has a track for the party. So let's take a look at Kronstadt Naval Base, for example. There's a revolutionary track and a government track. Below that, there's a placeholder. There's a box. That box is where the party in that area can actually create organizations. This models the difference between, say, the area having a revolutionary sentiment. People are talking about it, and they're unhappy with the government. They share the revolutionary ideology. Versus if there's an organization, and I'm going to place one there. That means there's actually a party organization there. They print leaflets, they hold meetings, they encourage strikes, they encourage disobedience to the officers if it's military, and so on. So every time you place an organization in an area, so let me get rid of this. Let's say we place an organization in Palace Square. That's a revolutionary. That's a generic organization. Then you move the organization track one in your favor. And I'm back on the right side. So you see each one of these can be worth as much as 2 victory points. So I moved it over 1. And now I'm back over to the other side of the board. I'm going to organize in Peter and Paul. So now the revolutionary has 2 organizations. That moves over here. So now when this organization track scores, they're going to get 4 victory points. Given that 20 victory points wins the game, that's a lot of victory points. That's 20% of your total. The government says, no, not so fast. I'm going to place an organization in the Winter Palace. So now it moves back 1 because what this track will reflect is the difference between the number of organizations each player has. Revolutionary has 2, government has 1, so in the first box over. Organizations can be created by doing a mobilization check. And very simply, the idea is you create a target number by taking the number of cubes you have in an area and the number of action points you're willing to spend, and you get those from a card you played, and you total that, and that gives you a number you want to roll on 3 dice or less. And we'll do some of that in the sample turn. But there's a check you do in order to create an organization. It's called a mobilization check. Now, the Duma, shifting our attention to the center of the board here, also can be organized. And it's critical for several reasons. First, if I create an organization in the Duma, like for example, if I organize a socialist, I don't just move over one spot on the organizations track, I move over two. Each Duma organization is worth up to 4 victory points. It's a lot of victory points. So by organizing in the Duma, I can net myself a lot of victory points. Another important part of that is if you look on the bottom, let's say you look underneath the liberals, you see the little hammer there and the little cross rifles under the monarchists. There are two special kinds of districts. Military districts, like say Kronstadt Naval Base on the left there, or Reserve Regiment Barracks, and worker districts. You see the little hammer. On the bottom, you'll see Putilov Munitions Works, Obukhov Steel Works. So, and the districts that have no symbol are just urban districts. So we have 3 kinds of districts: military, worker, and urban. The reason these parties are important is in order to create an organization in a worker district, the government would have to first have an organization in the Duma under liberals. So they'd have to do this before they could create any worker organizations. And so let's look at Nevsky shipyards. If that became organized, now we have a union. So it's a specialized thing. And why is it a union? Because there are any number of card events that will trigger off of how many unions have been created, off of, if you have more unions than your opponent, you can do certain things in any district you have a union. So that's very typical of the card events. So in order for the government player, looking back at the Duma, to create military organizations, they'd have to first create an organization in the monarchist. So if they did that, they move this back over to, and now they could create organizations, say, in the Reserve Regiment. When the government creates a military organization, it's called military discipline. And when they create a worker organization, it's called a union. In order for the revolutionary to organize, they'd have to create an organization in the radicals. Because you see, if you'll notice in the Duma, that both the hammer for the workers and the crossed rifles for the soldiers is under radicals. Organize that. Now they can create both worker and military organizations. When the revolutionary creates a military organization, it's called a soldier Soviet. And if we look down at the munition works below, if they create a workers' organization, it's called a worker Soviet. And similar to unions and military discipline, there are plenty of cards that have effects based on where and how many Soviets, unions, discipline you have. So organizations are critical because they're very high yield in victory points. Players will spend quite a bit of time trying to balance their play against gaining control of districts and paying for and placing organizations. There's a few more aspects of this we'll look at during the sample turn. Back to the scoring tracks on the right-hand side. So we've discussed how the districts are scored. Basically, we net out how many districts each player controls, and the player with more districts scores victory points. Same thing with organizations. We count up how many organizations, and when you create a regular organization or a union or a Soviet, you get 1 box movement. If you create a Duma organization, you get 2 boxes of movement. So can add up very quickly. Next down is the World Affairs track. This is a track that the players do not directly affect by board play. It is only affected by card play. So it doesn't move a lot, and you don't get many opportunities to move it. And it's often a difficult decision to decide to play a card to move the World Affairs because you're kind of leaving a gap in your play often, and will have to maybe fall a little bit behind. Let's have a look at the Duma. The Duma track, you can score either 2 or 4 points. It's relatively simple. 2 points is for majority. Majority means I have greater total cubes than you. So as the government in the Duma in this situation, government has 5 cubes, the revolutionary has 3 cubes total. So the government has at least a majority. To get 4 points instead, you'd have to have dominance. And what dominance means is my smallest party, in this case, the smallest party is the monarchists, for the government is at least as big, if not bigger, than my opponent's largest party. So my least populated is greater or equal to your most populated. And if that's the case, then I have dominance. So in this case, since the monarchist is at least as big as a socialist and the government has a majority, they actually have dominance in the Duma, which is historically models the fact that the Duma as a parliament type organization was originally started off pretty much dominated by conservative and liberal types and with some representation or reasonable amount of representation from more left wing, but it was pretty dominated by conservative types. It's only 2 to 4 victory points, but there's several other victory points at stake every time this Duma scores. And we'll see that when we have a look at the board. There's 2 more things I want to show you before we look at the game turn. One is something called the special actions. Each player will get one of these cards. The revolutionary gets Central Committee, the government gets Council of Ministers. What's happening here is each player has 6 special actions which they can play. They can only play 1 per turn. So, and once it's played, it's totally expended. Meaning if I play Pravda Propaganda as the revolutionary on turn 1, I can, then I flip it, it's done. That's it for the game. You cannot play that one again. So players really need to think carefully about how to use these special actions. Some of them are extremely powerful. Both players have the opportunity to affect how the cards get played, how to fiddle around with the composition of their hands, the scoring tracks, all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at them in some detail in the game, in the turn play. However, I also want to point out that there are 7 total turns in the game, and there's 6 actions. So if you let too many turns go by without playing one of these, you're not going to get to play all of them. You'll run out of turns because you get to play 1 a turn. Making yourself familiar with what these are and being able to spring one at just the right moment is very important to play. Last but not least, I will point out that each player will get a play aid card. And the idea of this is, of course, that each player gets references on how the scoring works and how the turn sequence works and how to do their growing extremism role, which we'll discuss. It tells you what you can do with opportunity points, what you can do with action points, how to do the various checks, how the cards are managed, how do you create an organization, which we discussed. So you'll have in hand a quick reference when you play the game on how to do this stuff. And before we go here, there's a lot of moving parts here. I want to wrap this up and say, yes, there's a lot of moving parts. And it can take a little bit of time to get used to it. But what I have found with many players, and I've played this game many times, is that once you become familiar with the various mechanics, it all fits together in a way that players can establish a strategy and an approach, and then focus their play on that strategy and approach. And one of the things I like most about this game is it rewards smart play. We were very careful not to introduce too many blockbuster events that simply throw the board up in the air and say, too bad, you've been smart all this game, and now we're just going to throw a hand grenade into the tent. The smart player will more than often win out over the haphazard player. So it encourages thought, it encourages strategy, and the game encourages smart play, which is something I like a lot. So that's it for the overview. Let's move on now to having some playthrough. We'll go through some turns and show you how all this stuff fits together. Okay, so let's have a look at the gameplay itself. Let's walk through the sequence. First of all, we'll note the game starts off with a setup. The board starts with a number of areas populated with cubes, as you can see. For example, the Kronstadt naval base is already a bit revolutionary. The Doom is already dominated by the government, etc. So that situation's all set up, and the scoring tracks are adjusted accordingly. The revolutionary controls 6 more areas in the government, so the little district scoring thing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 positions over from 0, and the Doom is already dominated by the government. So all of that is reflected. Each player will get 8 opportunity points at setup. We'll talk about how to use those in a moment. The loyal troops starts with 4 victory points worth of loyal troops in the military preparations box. That represents the fact that the military is pretty much behind the government at this point. The game centers in Petersburg, which, by the way, that map in the background is 1914 Petersburg, and the districts represent areas either thematically or actually within Petersburg that were important during the period leading up to the revolution. So the first thing that happens is the initiative. On the first turn of the game, the revolutionary has the initiative. Subsequently, the player who's behind on victory points has the initiative. If it's tied, the revolutionary gets it. What that does is it allows that player to determine who's going to play the first card. As you can see, if we look at a turn, each turn has 8 action rounds. As you can see, these boxes marked 1 to 8. And an action round is one player plays a card or does something, the other player plays a card or does something, and that's an action round, then it'll advance. So some players will say, no, you go first. I want to react to you because I want to have the last hand, I want to have the last laugh in each turn, in each action round. Other players may have a card in hand which is so critical, they got to get it out before something else happens, and they'll say, I'll go first. That's the decision of the revolutionary. Let's say the revolutionary says, let's let the government go first. So you can see down here in early years of turmoil, round 1, the round markers on the blue side, we'll leave it there. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. Each player draws a hand. I've taken the liberty of drawing a hand in advance. Each player has a hand of 7 cards. And as you can see, this is the revolutionary hand, and it's got some revolutionary cards like political tremors, or the will of the toiling masses. You might get some of your opponent's cards, like the government encouraging union organizations, or sometimes government might break those unions up. It was a very wishy-washy government. And there's also the neutral cards. So this, you get a mix of cards in your hand. Same thing here. The government has a couple of revolutionary cards, revolutionary activities, Second International, have some of their own cards, and even the neutral cards. So you will typically get a mix. The other part is here, we call it the opportunity pool. At the beginning of the game, we place several cards into this opportunity pool. And the opportunity pool represents cards that are placed when you have the physical copy of the game, they're placed on the table in these little areas. If you look at the very bottom of the map, you see there's a little tab that says Revolutionary Opportunity Pool, Neutral Opportunity Pool, Government Opportunity Pool. That's when you have physical cards. We don't really need that for the vassal. But here we have the Government Opportunity Pool up top. We see the picture of the Tsar and the blue background. In the middle, it's the neutral. And on the bottom, it's the revolutionary. These cards are available to be played. You don't automatically have to play them, but they can be played. If it's a revolutionary card in the opportunity pool, then only the revolutionary can play it from the pool. Here you see we have a neutral card in the opportunity pool, the direct appeal to the people. That card either player can pay to play. And finally, as you can see here, I'm going to flip the card so you can see the back. Up in the upper right corner, we have a key event. And the key event that comes into play at the beginning of the early turmoil period is Peter Stolypin. If you've not read about Peter Stolypin, he's worth looking up in Wikipedia. He's quite an interesting character. His main effect is he's got, if you can see, it's where it says remains in play. That's a special instruction. He'll stay in play all turn. And at the end of every government action round, the government will roll a die, and either maybe nothing will happen. On a 3 to 4, they'll score a VP. On a 5 to 6, it'll add 1 to the Tsar's prestige. So we have to. That's good because you want to keep it away from the abdication, but also you got to watch it that doesn't creep up too high. So this pool is available to both players. We mentioned opportunity points before. If you look at the very bottom of the screen, I'll remind you about each player gets 8 opportunity points at the beginning of each turn. One of the uses of opportunity points is to purchase cards from the opportunity pool. So, for example, let's start off. The government says, you know what? Let's get this party started. I'm going to spend 2 opportunity points. If you look on the bottom, I'm going to click it. I'm going to spend 2. So it goes from 8 to 6. And I'm going to take those 2 opportunity points and bring Peter Stolipin into play. So if you can see, I put Peter up in the corner here. So this is how a card play works. First thing I did is I bought a card from the opportunity pool. I would trigger any events that take place on the card. Now this card doesn't trigger until the end of my round. And then I would roll a scoring die. So you could see the O to the left of the eagle on top of the card. That means I would roll the organization scoring die. If you look at the organization scoring die, it's a 6-sided die. 3 of the faces have an O on it. Then there's one face with a D, one face with a DI, and one face with a WA. So there's a 50% chance that the organizations will move forward, but there's also a chance that any of the others will move forward. So I'll roll that die, and let's assume it comes up O. When it comes up, looking at the organization scoring track, we move the score marker up 1. We would now, it's the end of the government's action round. And if you remember, at the end of each of your action rounds, you roll 1 die. So I'm going to roll a die, and it's going to come up with a 5. So the Czar's prestige increases by 1. I'm going over to the Czar's prestige track. I'm going to raise the prestige by 1. And that's the end of the government action round 1. Let's flip this over. Now it's the revolutionary's turn to play action round 1. Let's have a look at the revolutionary's cards. Well, look here. This is a neutral card. It can be played by either player. When you're playing a card, you can do one of a couple of things with it. One thing you can do with it is play the card for action points. It's worth 2. The second thing you could do is play it for its event. In this case, the event is your choice. You remove 1 cube from the Duma, which models, the terroristic atmosphere of the day, scared deputies and said, I'm not doing that. I'm staying home. Or you can discard the Peter Stolipin card from play. So this is very typically the case where the revolutionary really doesn't want Peter hanging around. So the revolutionary will play this card for the event. So the first thing that happens is we'll discard Peter Stolipin from play. So here's the sequence of actions. The card comes out. I say I'm playing this for the event. I trigger my event, discard Peter Stolipin from play. Goodbye, Mr. Stolipin. Sorry. The brief career of Peter Stolipin. Then, once we're done with the event on the card, we roll the die. So I'm going to get the die that has DU, which stands for Duma, and roll it. So there's 3 faces which could come up and move the Duma, but 1 each for the other. So I roll it, and lo and behold, it comes up O. So let me play this card for the event, get rid of it, and the O will come up, move. I do that because I want you to realize that even though it says DU on the card, or it says one thing on the card, there's only a 50% chance that that will move forward. Okay, so that was the end of the round. Now we will advance the round marker. And that was 1 of 8 rounds in this turn. So let's continue. It's the government's turn. Let's look at their hand. This is a first look at the government hand because we already played a card from the opportunity pool last time. Let's see what our hand looks like. So another thing, when we play one of our own cards, let's say Ochrana infiltrates revolutionary cells, it's our card. We can choose to play it for 4 action points or for the event. On the other hand, let's say I, for some reason, wanted to play this card, which that can happen. You can get stuck to the point where you only have your opponent's cards in your hand. If I'm playing my opponent's card, so I'm the government, but I'm looking at playing a revolutionary card, I can play this card for the action points only, and we'll use those action points in a moment. After I play the card for action points, then the event triggers for my opponent. And then, as always, we will roll the scoring die. So I just want to caution those of you who might be familiar with, say, Twilight Struggle, where you can spend your points and trigger the action, or trigger the action and then spend the points. In this game, it's a strict sequence of points, then action. All right, so I get 4. Let me put this card on the table, and I'm putting this here just so we can keep the card in our view. So first thing is I'll score 4 action points. So what can I do with action points? I can do a couple of things, and let's look at the play aids. One thing we can do with action points is mobilize in districts. Mobilize means place cubes. We can mobilize in districts, as you see, or we can mobilize in the Duma. The basic cost for placing a cube in a district is 1 action point. That's increased by the little extra cost marker that I pointed out to you before. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to place some cubes in districts. But what else could we do? We could place cubes in the Duma. The Duma costs 2 action points to place, so it's twice as expensive to start building points in the Duma. Also, remember those special actions I showed you? Each one carried an action point cost. We could buy one of those, and we'll do that later, or create organizations, which we'll also do later. But let's start off with the simplest one, which is district mobilization. All right, basic cost of 1. So I have 4 to spend. So as the government playing a revolutionary card, first I'll spend 1 in the Winter Palace. So I'll place 1 cube in the Winter Palace. That's 1 of 4 action points spent. I'm going to place 1 in Vasilyevsky Island. So now this is where we learn about catching up. You can see next to Vasilyevsky Island, the first spot there's a +1. So normally that would be 1 to place plus 1 penalty. Cost me 2 action points there. But since I am catching up, I start off with fewer cubes than my opponent. As long as I have fewer and I'm still catching up, I get a 1 action point discount to a minimum cost of 1. So for example, this 1 would cost me 1 action point to place, plus 1 for this penalty, minus 1 because I'm catching up. So the total is 1. So now I've spent 2 action points. I'm going to now, I'd love to place another one here, but I can't because it cost me 1 to place plus 2. Very, very revolutionary area. The government is not welcome there. So before I go further, before I place this, so far I've spent 2 action points, and you notice in this case, the revolutionary had control of this area. They had more cubes in there. When I place 1 in there, now it's even. I've taken control away. So I'd go back to the right-hand side, and on the district track, I would move it down 1, meaning I've removed control of 1 area. So that's great. So now I have 2 action points to spend. I like the idea of reducing the revolutionary hold in my military, so I'm also going to place 1 in the reserve regiment barracks. So again, that's 1 to place it, 1 action point penalty, that would be 2, but since I'm catching up, I get a 1 action point discount, so the total is a 1. So that's my 3rd action point out of 4 spent. And again, I've taken control of this away from the revolutionary, so the reserve regiment barracks, no longer revolutionary controlled. Let me move this up back 1 more. And where else can I do that? Oh, good. You know what? I'm going to also place my last one in the Palace Square. Now this cost me 1 to place. Now the government did not control it before and they gained control. So it's 1 more area they control. This track on the right-hand side under districts will move 1 more. So that was 4 action points spent. All right, so we put an extra in the Winter Palace and we took control of 1, 2, 3 areas. So not bad. Now, going back to the card, it's my opponent's card. So now the event will trigger. The Second International, +1 on the World Affairs track. Okay, so it moves 1 towards the revolutionary. It starts off at World Affairs, starts off at +1 for the government. Generally speaking, people are happy there's a czar and that he's, stable government and all that. World affairs will move over one, and that's that. That's the event. Last but not least, we roll the world affairs die. So remember, it'll have world affairs on three faces, but one each of the other ones. So we roll the die, and up comes DU, Duma. All right, the Duma moves forward one. So we've spent the action points, we've done the event, we've rolled the die, this card is discarded. That was the government side of the action. Just a comment here. In a lot of card-driven games, you wind up playing cards that your opponent acts on. We found that it was very helpful to be diligent about the round marker. If you look in the lower left corner, sometimes what we would do is if it's the first player playing, we put it up top. And then when the second player goes, we put it on the bottom to remind us who's playing. Because, you're playing cards and I played a card, but then I did stuff, then you did stuff, and then you play a card and I do stuff. And it can get confusing. So this little mechanism that we do helps us keep track of who is acting at the current time. So now the government is gone. Now it's the revolutionaries' turn to play their next round. Okay, so let's do another version of this. So we had a situation just now where the government played the opponent's card. They got the action points, but their opponents got the event. Let's have a look at the revolutionary hand. There's a card in there for the government called Unions Are Encouraged. They'd like to play this for the 4 action points. Now, you'll notice that under Union Encouraged, there's a prerequisite that says the Liberal Party organization has been created. When this card gets played, the event cannot trigger unless the prerequisite has been met. So let's see what happens. So let's have a look. The first thing that'll happen is the revolutionary gets 4 action points to spend, and we'll spend them in a moment. Let's do that. Let's look at our play aid and see what else we can do with action points. One thing we can do is mobilize in districts, which we just did some of. The next thing we can do is mobilize in the Duma, but it costs 2 points per placement, and there are some penalties, but let's have a look. But the revolutionary says, if I look at this board, I need to get my radicals organized if I ever want to organize any workers or soldiers. So I better get started now. I'm going to place 2 revolutionary cubes in the Duma. Right? Each one costs 2. So I'm spending 4 action points. If you recall, this card is worth 4 action points. So I'm going to spend the 4 action points placing in the Duma. 2, 4. All right. Now something has happened here, but we have to now check that the game has changed. Now the revolutionary has 5 cubes, as does the government have 5 cubes. They no longer have a majority, and therefore they can no longer have dominance, because to have dominance, you need to have a majority. So the Duma is now at parity. There's no majority, nobody dominates. So the revolutionaries are getting in there and playing political games with the government and strengthening their revolution, their radicals. Now, in normal play, if you play an opponent's card, the event triggers, but the event can't trigger here. So what happens? What happens here is this card gets sent to the opportunity pool because the event hasn't triggered. It goes to the opportunity pool. So now the government has this card potentially for play later, and the government will get half of the action point value of the card as opportunity points. So the government is going to gain I'm going to add 1, add 2 opportunity points. So to look at it all again, the revolutionary played this card. They got 4 action points. The government could not trigger, the prerequisite wasn't met, but the card goes in the pool, is available for later play if possible, and the government gets half the value, AP value, in opportunity points. The purpose of this mechanic is so that you don't just get to say, I played your card and you're not going to get access to it. No, if I play your card, not only does it go into the pool potentially, and you may be able to play it later, say you do create a liberal party organization and you want to play this, but I also get some opportunity points out of the deal. So it's a balance, more of a balance. It's not a one-sided play. That was the revolutionary play. One more thing has to happen. Sorry. The revolutionary player rolls the district die because to the left of the eagle there, you see the DI, district. So we roll it, up comes districts, DI. So the district moves forward. That was the second round. All right, let's move on. Next player, we're in round 3. You notice with the experienced players who use this system, we'll call it the top of the third, right? Because we're the first player in round 3 is going. So we put it on top. All right, what should the government do? It's the government's turn. Let's see. There's some interesting options here. I think what we want to do now is let us look at what else we can do with activity points. We can purchase special actions. If you remember, we have those special actions, and here's how you purchase them. I'm going to look at my special action deck. I would like to do Novoye Vremya, which was the Tsarist house newspaper. It was sort of the Fox News of the day. Very, very, very right wing. So this says the next time you play a government card from your hand, you play the AP and the event. And of course, you can't get the event unless the prerequisite is met. So this gets sent to the round marker, meaning you'll read it next time I play a government card. By the way, this isn't you may play, you must play. So the very next government card, owned card that gets played is going to trigger this. So you got to be careful and make sure you have a card you want to use this with. But since we're just an example. Now, the way I pay for that is I go to my deck and I say, okay, I need to pay for that with action points. I'm going to use the government activities. Now, the activities cards, both players have activities cards. And with the activities, there are government activities and there are revolutionary activities. When you play a government activities card, you can play it for the AP. If it's my card, that's very typical, is what I'll play it for. The other thing you could do is you could take 2 action points or gain 2 opportunity points. So there's 3 options for this card. One is I could just take 4 action points worth of actions. Now, the other is I could take 2 action points worth of actions, which seems strange, or gain 2 opportunity points. Now, why is that not necessarily strange? Because what if the revolutionary plays this card? They would get 4 action points, but then the government would get 2 because the event would trigger. So it goes both ways. So, okay, so I get 4 action points. So the first 2 action points I'm going to spend on buying Novoye Vremya, right? So now that's 2. I've got 2 more. So what I'm going to do with my other 2 action points, I think I'd like to put some more cubes in districts. I'm going to place a government cube in Kazan Cathedral next to the Duma. And by doing that, I will reduce the number of controlled revolutionary districts by 1 again. I got 1 more action point to spend, and I'll spend that one getting a little more influence in the Okhrana. That doesn't change control. No, it leaves a control scenario, but it builds up a little more strength in there, and we'll see why. So that's the 4 action points have been spent on this card. Now I get to roll the scoring die, and instead of an O or a D, it's government choice. So the government looks at the board and says, typically you'll look at the board and say, where am I ahead? Where am I looking best? Or where do I think I have the best prospects? And right now the government says, I suspect I'm going to do well in the Duma. So I'm going to roll the Duma die. So I roll the Duma die and up comes districts. Huh. Okay. Because you never know what's actually going to play. So we did everything on this card. We spent the action points and we rolled the scoring die. Let's discard. And now it is the Revolutionaries' third round. Here's the hand. Here are the things. But let's take a look at the opportunity pool. Remember, the opportunity pool is a place where either player can spend opportunity points to get stuff. So let's see. This is the option for the revolutionary in the opportunity pool, La Marseillaise. So I'm going to spend 4 opportunity points. I'll get to roll, placed 4 of them. It says add a total of 4 cubes, and then maybe another one. All right, I'll go for it. So instead of playing a card, let's look at the play aid because I think this is going to be using opportunity points. What we're doing now is play the event of a card from the opportunity pool, right? It's my faction, and there's no prerequisite involved. So yeah, I'm going to spend opportunity points. So let's look at the pool. La Marseillaise is 4 opportunity points, and I will spend them off of my track. So now I started with 8. I just spent 4. So my opportunity track is on 4. I take the card from the opportunity pool, La Marseillaise, and let's have a look at it. This card, I add a total of 4 cubes in worker or military districts, no more than 2 per district. Now, one thing I want to point out here is when I add means I don't have to pay the penalty. It's just placing. So whereas if I can only place in military or worker districts as per the card, right? It says in work. So I'm going to place 1 cube in the capital garrison. Now, normally, if you look at the capital garrison, you'll see there's a +2 penalty. Normally, that would cost me 1 to place +2. That would be a 3-point placement. But no, in this case, it just cost me. I'm placing. That's great. That saves me a lot of points. Next, and by the way, I just took control of that. So it went from even to now I have more, so I control it. The districts goes up 1. So I'm going to place another one in the guards regiment. I'm going to rather see what, send someone in there to talk to the guards about the people's will. That would normally cost me 1 to place, +2 penalty, -1 because I'm catching up. That would normally cost me 2, but since I'm placing, it just is a placement. So that gives me, neutralizes that area. I have 2 more to place. I can place 1 more in the Guards Regiment barracks. No more than 2 in any area, but that's my second one there. Again, I don't pay any penalties. I'm placing by event. Big advantage. So that one gives me control of the area. And now I have 1 more to place. And strategically, I'm going to start placing cubes in the Nevsky Prospect. And that's because it has influence on other areas I'm interested in. Doesn't change the districts, but it does give me more control there. So that's how the placement works, a very important aspect. Let's look at the card. I get to do one more thing. I'm going to roll a die, and I'm going to roll a 1, 1, 2, 3. I get to place yet another cube in Telrita Palace, or 4, 5, 6, Revolutionary Unrest goes up, which is a little nasty, but I roll the die, and unfortunately a 5 comes up. So the Revolutionary Unrest goes up 1. As I'll remind you, this is going to go up 1 every turn, no matter what. And there's plenty of events that drive it up. And I get negative die roll modifiers. As I start getting into this range, you see the +1. That plus is bad. +2 is even worse. So right now it's not much, but it will keep growing. Okay, so now I roll the scoring die. It calls for a DI. That's a district. Okay, I roll the district, and bam, up comes a DI, so the district advances. Okay, let's discard. That was the end of the round. As you can see, there's a rhythm. You play a card, you play for AP or events, or you play your opponent's card, you play for AP, and they get the event if there's a prerequisite. If not, it goes into the pool. You can use your APs to place cubes in the Duma or on the board. You can use it to buy special events. Let's move forward. Now we're at the beginning of round 4. Now let's not forget that the government who's playing now has this Novoye Vremya, which means it gets to play not just the card for the action points, but also for the event, their event. So let's see what they got. One very powerful way to play this, we'll do it this way. We're going to play government activities as the government. That means the player is going to get 6 action points to spend, right? That's the event, that's the APs, and it gets the event too, which means we can get 3 more action points or get some opportunity points. All right, so let's spend 6 action points. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend 6 action points, and we're going to try and create an organization in the Liberal Party. We haven't talked about organization creation yet, but it works like this. You create a target number and you roll 3 dice to try and meet that target number. The target number is created like this. First, I take the number of cubes in the track I'm trying to check. So in this case, it's liberals. So that's a 3. Got 3 cubes there. Then I add the number of action points I'm willing to spend. You have to spend a minimum of 2, but he's going to spend all 6. He really wants to make sure this works. So it would be 3 plus 6 is 9. That's my target number. That means I need to roll a 9 or less on 3 dice to be able to pass this mobilization check. So clearly, the higher the number of cubes or action points you spend, the better your chances of passing this check. So I'm going to roll 3 dice on behalf of the government, and unfortunately rolls a 12. Needed to roll a 9 or less, it rolled a 12. It's off by 3. Now, let me just show you this. It's very important. What else can we use with that opportunity points? We can increase the target number of a mobilization check. Our target number was 9. We needed to roll a 9 or less. We can spend opportunity points to increase that target number so that we pass, meaning I can spend 3 opportunity points and make my target number into a 12 and make this into a pass. And in fact, that's what I'm going to do. So please note that these mobilization checks, one of the things you can do is create organizations with them. And if you fail a mobilization check, you can spend opportunity points to make up the difference and pass. So first, let me spend my opportunity points. I need to bring it down to 5. I now have 5 left, and that changes my target number here from 9 to 12. I rolled a 12, and I succeed. Special action is marked spent. If you look in the lower left corner, it's now spent, it's done. And I will now organize the liberals. Before I do that, I want you to note the little hammer. That means after this liberal organization is created, the government can now also create worker organization, can create unions. So here we go. When you create a Duma organization in a party, the organization track moves 2 spots in your favor. 1, 2. Now that's a lot. It's now on 4. That means the government has a 4-point advantage on that track. That's a big advantage. Now, because we played that special event, not only do we get those 6 action points, but we get to choose, we do the event, perform 3 activities worth 3 AP, or gain 3 opportunity points. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to replenish my opportunity points, because as you can see, they're very valuable. So I'm going to do add 1 OP, add 1, add 1. I could have also taken 3 more action points worth of actions, but this is what I chose to do. Last but not least, the government gets to choose which die to roll. It's the government's choice, and they're going to roll the organization die. And lo and behold, up comes O, and organization moves forward 1. Now it will discard this card. All right, so let's play the revolutionary side of this round. Let's see what the revolutionary has in their hand. The revolutionary has an activities card too. It's the exact mirror of the government activities. If we play it as a revolutionary, basically it's good to get 6 action points. So that's quite a few action points. Revolutionary is going to get busy, however. Let's look at the opportunity pool. You cannot play any of these cards up on top. Those are government cards. It could try a direct appeal to the people. And you could see, remember we just learned about mobilization checks. You get a target number and you try and roll 3 dice or less. This one has a special mobilization check as part of the event. So sometimes the events will cause mobilization checks, but none of these things are particularly appealing. So what the revolutionary is going to do is say, look, I got to get busy organizing I can't leave that 4-point advantage to the government, so I'm going to go ahead and play my revolutionary activities card. And I'm going to do 2 things. One, I'm going to spend the action points in 2 different ways. And I want to point out, In some of these games, when you spend points, you can do one thing with those points. Like if you spend points, you can do a influence check or whatever the game is, and that's it. In the Prelude system, if you have 6 action points, you can do 6 points worth of stuff. I can play some cubes, I can buy a special action, I can do a mobilization check as long as I have enough points to go around. So what we're going to do here is we'll spend 2 of our 6 points to put a cube in the socialists. Well, here we go. So now let's take a look at that's 2 out of 6 have been spent. Now the revolutionary has more cubes than the government, so it's got a majority, but also its smallest party, which is a 3, either one, is at least as big as the opponent's largest party, a 3. So now suddenly I've just moved the Duma track to 4. The revolutionary is dominating the Duma. That's a pretty slick move. So that's 2. And the revolutionaries also going to spend the remaining 4 action points to attempt to create an organization in the radicals party. So let's go ahead and figure out the target number. We're doing a mobilization check, so we need a target number. That's the number of cubes, just 3. The number of action points spent, so we've already spent 2 of these, so we have 4 more action points. That's 7. So the target number is 7. Pretty low, but let's give it a shot. And the revolutionary rolls and rolls a 6 on 3 dice. Unlikely, but lucky. So the revolutionaries succeeded. They create a radical organization, which, if you notice, means they can now do both worker and military districts to organize. And the organization moves back towards them. That was a strong political play by the revolutionaries. And now the revolutionary chooses which die to roll. And the revolutionary is going to say, I like the way the Duma stands, so let me roll the Duma die. However, up comes districts. So the district scoring moves forward 1. It's on the scoring box now. So what happens? Let's look. The play aid has the scoring procedure for each area. Scoring the districts is pretty easy. All you do is whoever's favorite on the track scores that number of points, and we reset the tracks. It's a good idea to count the districts just to make sure that in the course of play we haven't forgotten to move it. So let's see, how many districts does the revolutionary have more cubes or control? From left to right. Kronstadt is 1. Not reserved, not Vasilyevsky. Putilov is 2. Guards Regiment is 3. Steelworks is 4. Shipyards is 5. Viborg is 6. Nevsky is 7. Capital Garrison is 8. And Smolny Institute is 9. So revolutionary controls a total of 9. Let's count up the government-controlled areas. They don't control any of these on the left. Palace Square is 1. Winter Palace is 2. Okhrana is 3. And State Bank is 4. So the government controls 4. The revolutionary controls 9. The government controls 4. So the revolutionary should be 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I forgot to do it when we did the placement. That means the revolutionary scores 3 victory points on this district scoring. Not bad. So I'm going to add points. 1, see the 2, 3, and this gets reset. Gets started at the beginning again. And the revolutionary chose which die. It was the districts, and that was it. So now we discard the card. That was a revolutionary play. Okay, we're now entering round 5, and this is a special round. I want you to note on the turn track, there's dark and there's like a little semicircular seating area modeled. That's a Duma session turn. So during these turns, when it's shaded like that, the Duma is in session. You see it's in session in round 5 in the early, round 6 in the late, in the early Great War, it's in session for 2, etc. Being in session implies a couple of things. One, there are a lot of cards where the Duma being in session is a prerequisite. So that's one thing. The second thing is at the end of this turn, we're going to do what's called a Duma vote, and we'll see how that works. So let's just play through the round. So the government says, okay, so I know there's I don't want the revolutionary getting any more chances to mess with me again. So I'm going to play this Okhrana. The Okhrana infiltrates revolutionary cells. So it's a Years of Turmoil card. I could play it for the AP, but not this time. I like the event. Revolutionary loses 3 opportunity points. So just like that, we spend 2 and 1 more. They're down to 1 opportunity point. That's not great. Okay, and then the government rolls the O die. It comes up WA. So WA moves forward 1, and that discards the card. Now it's the revolutionary's turn to play. That puts a crimp in the revolutionary's plan, but we do have a Duma vote coming up, so now it's time to have some political tremors. Powerful card. Let's see what it does. It's a Years of Turmoil revolutionary card. We add 3 cubes to the Duma. Wow, because those cubes are expensive, right? Because that would normally cost at least 6 action points, so we're getting a big bargain here. Okay, so let's do it. So I added 3 cubes there. I have got a really strong showing in the Duma, and we'll see what that implies later. However, the card has a little bit of a kick there. It says +1 to revolutionary unrest. So the idea here is what happened in history is it got more and more contentious, more angry, more insulting, more vitriolic, and this started now. It just got worse and worse. In fact, in several cases historically, the Tsar just had enough of them and exercised his right to dissolve or prorogue the Duma, which is an option in the game. It's a card. Anyway, let's punt up the revolutionary unrest track, another one. Okay, well, we're starting to get a little bit higher there, right? But that's the cost of victory there. And last but not least, as with every card, we roll the scoring die. It's a DU, and what comes up is WA. Okay, so World Affairs moves forward. All right, so we're at the end of the second action round in a Duma session. So let's look at the handy play aid. We're having a Duma vote. So at the end of the Duma, it says starting with the first player, each player executes the following procedure. You do a +2 mobilization check. The idea is we're going to do a mobilization check on each of our parties. For each successful one, we score a point. And then the person with the majority at the end of all this scores a point. So let's see what happens. So the monarchist does a +2 mobilization check because they're the first player on their extremist party. Their extremists are the monarchists. So they have 2 cubes and they get a +2. So that's a 4. They need to roll a 4 or less on 3 dice. Not too likely. Now remember, they couldn't spend opportunity points. So they roll the dice. Up comes a 14. Way off. And it's not worth spending all those points to get 1 VP. So that's that. Now the revolutionary has 5 cubes. And I'm going to open the play aid again for a second. Because if you note, it says perform a +2 mobilization check. +4, the party has an organization. So the revolutionary has a +4 mobilization check here. So it's 5 for the cubes, +4 for having a party there, and they roll a 7. They succeed. So their success gives them a victory point. However, now we're going to learn a little bit about growing extremism. If the mobilization check in the extremist parties is a success, perform a growing extremism roll. What's that? That means if anytime you do a vote, or in several other cases, by the way, and you succeed, which you did as a revolutionary, you succeeded with your mobilization check in your extremist party, the radicals, you now do a growing extremism roll. Essentially, you roll a d6. Sometimes the event card may modify you, adding to this. The higher you roll, the worse it is for you, basically. So you're going to roll a d6. You'll add anything the event says, because sometimes it says do a growing extremism check with an additional +1. And the other thing that happens is you add in your modifier from your track. So the revolutionary would add in this modifier. Right now it's 0, but let's say you were up here somewhere, you'd be adding 1. So you're worsening this roll by 1, or maybe even 2. Similarly, if the Tsar's prestige drops and the government is making this roll, or the Tsar's prestige gets too high, they're going to be adding one or two. But in this case, you are adding neither. So we roll a die and you get incredibly unlucky and roll a 6. And what does it say? It says remove one cube from the rolling player's moderate party, then move one cube from the rolling player's moderate to their extremist party. That means as a result of this die roll, you're going to lose a cube and one's going to move from the moderate to your extremist. All right, so what's the result there? You say, okay, that's not so bad. Well, actually, it's pretty bad because two things have happened. One, you no longer have dominance. Your smallest party, which is your socialist, is no longer at least as big as your opponent's largest party. So you'll lose dominance. It goes down to a majority. Secondly, you lost a cube, but also now a cube is moved over. Every time you roll growing extremism, now your radicals are yet stronger. They're more likely to pass the next check. It's more likely you're going to lose socialists and move them into the radicals who get yet even stronger and even stronger. So as this mechanic builds on itself, you wind up in a situation where your moderates either go home, say, I'm out of here, this is getting crazy, or they shift over towards the more extremist politics. And as more extremist politics take over, it's more likely to succeed. At some point, you might wind up with an empty socialist party. You've sent them all home or moved them all into the radicals. If that happens and you score the Duma, you lose points. At some point, you may wind up filling your radical party, right? You keep putting cubes until you have all 10 filled. The next time you're supposed to move something, instead you're going to lose it or lose victory points. So in the very beginning, have a strong radical party can be an advantage. I'll remind you, for example, the revolutionary needs to organize the radicals to be able to build worker and soldier Soviets. But us also makes it more likely to pass growing extremism checks, which makes it more likely going to eventually lose points and get in a bad position. I really like this mechanic, by the way, as you can probably tell, because it really models the increasing snowballing effect of extremist politics. In but here we go. So that was we've done everything here. We've done the event. We've moved the track. We've rolled the dice, so now we can discard it. Okay, so that was this. Now we do the same check. So he passed. He got his victory points. We're still doing a Duma vote. I'll remind you, we rolled for the monarchists. They failed. The radicals did pass. And now we do the others. So the liberals, this is the moderate party. So it's 3 for the cubes, 4 for the party, right? It's +4. So that's 3 + 4 is 7. They roll a 7. They get a victory point. So they get a victory point back. And since it's the moderates, there's no growing extremism roll. And the socialists roll, they get a 2 cubes +2 for the +2 check. So it's a total of 4. They roll a 9. They're not going to bother spending. And ultimately, they have a majority. The players that holds a majority now gets a point. So ultimately, the revolutionary gains 1 point out of this process. You can net as many as 3 extra points, right? If you score both of your parties and you have a majority and your opponent doesn't score, you can get 3 VPs out of this deal. But really, the revolutionary came out of this a little bit injured because they lost some socialists and now their extremist politics is starting to get a little bit of steam, which is not a good thing generally. So let's discard this card. I'm going to conclude the sample turn now because I think you've seen pretty much everything. There's a scoring sequence for each track. Just talk through it very quickly. It's very simple. For districts, as you saw, you just total up how many districts there are in award points. For organizations, it's the same thing. You count how many organizations, like each player has one party organization, so that nets to 0. And let's say there were some organizations on the board, you net that out and score the difference. World affairs will just be positioned by card play. And then ultimately the Duma, you'll score the Duma track, right? But the player with a stronger extremist party, let's see, let's take a look at the scoring sequence, by the way. Scoring the Duma, the player with the higher extremist value, that is the stronger extremist party, makes a growing extremism roll. And once again, you might get stuck as, say, the revolutionary in this scenario, moving out socialists and losing cubes and all this other stuff. So, for example, in this case, if a socialist had to move a cube and remove a cube, it would look like this after growing extremism. They'd have an empty party that will award the other player a victory point. So you can see how increasingly radical politics are going to hurt you in the end, because now the extremists are even more likely to win the next mobilization check. Anyway, so that's how the scoring sequence works. You saw how opportunity points work. You got cards in the pool that you can purchase and deploy. You saw how special actions work. That is, you have special actions. You can play one per turn. You buy them with action points. You saw what happens when you play your card. You play either action points or event. You have to meet the prerequisites. So, for example, in this case, the will of the toiling masses can be played because as an event, because the radical party has been created. You can play your opponent's card. You play the AP, but then they get to do their event if the prerequisite is met. If they don't get to play their event because of prerequisite, it goes into the pool and they get 2 opportunity points or half the value at opportunity points. The only permutation we didn't go through is if I played a neutral card for just the APs, which I can. If I do that, then the card goes into the neutral area of the pool. So if I played this before APs, I could play the APs and then this just gets thrown into the neutral area of the pool and either player can play it later. I'm going to talk about 2 other things that can happen, 2 other major events. Essentially, what happens now is we'll continue trading rounds, playing cards. At the end of the 8th round of the turn, we'll refresh our hand to 7. There's no passing. There's no discarding. You got to play the cards you got. So let's revisit this, meaning that as a revolutionary player, if you've got 7 cards, you've got 8 rounds to play. So you're going to play a card every round and you got to do something else like spend opportunity points from the pool or play a special action or something. So part of the game is figuring out how not to play the really harmful cards. What winds up happening is once we get into the late area, I'll show you the key deck. What would happen is we refresh our hands. As you can see, there's a card that'll come into play. There's a key card that will go into the pool. We may wind up you get the opportunity of triggering a vote. And there's some special conditions. So at the end of the 8th round of this turn, we would discard all cards in play, either the ones that are lingering because they are persistent events, or anything in your hand, or anything on the board, or anything in the pool. It all goes away, and we start off with the next era. That means we would we would now go and start using this deck, the Great War deck. And we would play each turn, assuming nothing else dramatic happens, we play the cards from the Great War, which have Great War specific events and Great War themes. As you can see, I'll show you also that the key events for the Great War, one of the big personalities of the era, Rasputin, comes into play. He generally tends to lower the Tsar's prestige and may even force an abdication, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing that can happen in the Great War is the option for the Russians to enter the war. It's a government card, and the government has the option of playing the war card. It's not a foregone conclusion. It doesn't have to happen. The other thing that can happen in the Great War is if the war card is played and the Tsar's prestige is low enough, or there's been a military disaster, which is a card in play, the Tsar can take over the army, which did happen historically. Now, not a great event for the government, it can help, but you get a bunch of cubes and some VPs, but a lot of very nasty events can be enabled when the Tsar is taking command. So these key events, sometimes it's personality like Kerensky or Lenin. Sometimes it's a what if situation, like the Tsar grants a constitution. This was a big objective for a lot of the liberals and socialists in the Duma to say, listen, just let's convert this to a constitutional monarchy. You can stick around, but give us a constitution. The Tsar can be forced to grant one, and this is a big prerequisite for other things. So those are the key events that'll get played into the pool that become available. We'll go through the early and the late Great War, and then there's 3 turns in the collapse era. February, July, and October, the 3 critical months during that year. Winning the game, there's really pretty straightforward. If any player ends a round with 20 victory points, game over, you won. Second way a game can end is if the Revolutionary Unrest track reaches 15, then Red October is triggered. Red October is a scoring sequence. I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but essentially every one of these tracks scores, but some special things happen on each track. So, for example, before you score the district tracks, we compare the number of unions versus the number of worker Soviets, and whoever's got more gets to place some cubes in districts and swing the scoring in one way. Similarly, at the beginning of the Red October, the government gets to try and use military discipline to shut down the soldier Soviets, that is, remove organization and swing the organization track their way. So each of these tracks has some swing in the Red October scoring sequence. And I've seen any number of times players like the Revolutionary player just simply says, I got an advantage. If we have Red October, I've got a board advantage on each track. I want to trigger it. And if you'll notice, one of the things that Comrade Lenin can do is he can increase revolutionary unrest every turn if he chooses to. So if Lenin's in play and you think you got an advantage as the revolutionary, you can just drive it up every round. And then, in the few action rounds, you can trigger Red October if you choose to. The other strategy is sometimes, the government can be in very strong position. They have 4 victory points in this loyal troops box. You can wind up in a situation where Red October, if you got a lot of loyal troops hanging around the capital and you're in pretty good position on the other tracks, you might want to just provoke Red October. Just drive it up yourself with card events, which is historically Kerensky, who ran the provisional government, said, "Let the Bolsheviks march. I will crush them." He wanted them to come out and try to take over. He thought he could win. So there's a lot of opportunities for various strategies to end the game with Red October. Another way the game ends, not so good, is autocracy reimposed. Let's say Peter Stolypin drove that prestige way up, and when you go to war, the prestige goes up more, and other events cause it to creep up. If it reaches 15, the game's just over and both players lose. Or you could just get to the end of the game. You get to the end of the 8th round in October 1917, and whatever the circumstance, whoever's got more points won. So you can play the long game. You can try to force a dramatic event. You can by provoking Red October, you can force the reimposition of autocracy if you're way behind and you're satisfied with the equivalent of both of you losing. A bunch of different ways to go, depending on the board and this strategy. The last thing I'll talk about is when the Tsar's prestige, or should it reaches 0, because it very easily can, the Tsar will abdicate. So a bunch of things happen. There's a special deck of cards called the Provisional Government. These get shuffled into the deck, and I'll flip a few. So I'll just draw the top 5 cards of this deck to show you. So these are things that happen, most of them tend to be specific events. Oh, good. Okay, so we got a couple of different ones. So here's one, treason. If Vladimir Lenin's in play, basically it came to light at some point that Lenin had basically been shipped home by the Germans, was financing the Bolshevik Party with German money, because the Germans were still at war with the Russians at this point. So if you play this card for the provisional government, Lenin goes back into the opportunity pool, and the revolutionary loses 2 OPs. So this only happens if the Tsar's already abdicated. A couple of other things happen. The Petrograd Soviet was sort of a shadow government or competing government with the Duma. And if they're in play, there can be confusion in the military. They started issuing orders to the military, and the military wasn't sure who are they listening to, the Duma or the Petrograd Soviet. Right? These are things that would only happen after the Tsar has abdicated. So the deck gets adjusted. All of these cards, and I'll show you some key cards that this would apply to. All the cards with this star triangle in the corner come out, are removed from the deck, from the key deck, and there's a bunch in the collapse deck. And these provisional government cards get shuffled in. The other thing that happens is all of the organizations on the board are removed. You'll notice now the radicals and the monarch, well, there's no more monarchists, obviously, not in power in the Duma. And the radicals basically in the beginning just really wanted nothing to do with the Duma. The Bolsheviks refused to participate mostly in the very beginning. So all of these go out of play. And look, now the Duma is just 2 parties, the liberals and the socialists. These are out of play. The Duma can only be a majority. There's no more dominance. There's a provisional government in place. So there's a bunch of things change after the abdication, but play continues. So despite the Tsar's abdication, play continues. So I think you now have a good idea of all of the key mechanics in the game, how to play cards, how to take advantage of special actions, how to keep an eye on the tracks and how the scores and tracks work, how the the Red October and Czar's Prestige track works, how to use opportunity points, and how to play with the opportunity pool, balancing your play between playing in districts on the board or playing in the Duma. And I'll just conclude by saying the game really does reward strategic thinking and a working knowledge. So understanding whether you want to, as the government, you want to play heavily into the Duma and play a lot of politics and play a game of suppression and try and keep the czar in power, or if you're the revolutionary, you're saying, nope, I'm just going to control as many districts as I can and score that as often as I can. I'm going to organize as quickly as I can versus I'm going to do as much as I can to impede my opponent. There's a lot of ways to go at the game. Of course, it's a card game, so it's going to depend on what card you get. But remember, there's the opportunity pool where you see what cards are available. There are the key events where you know or can be available for play. So while there is the randomness of the cards, and I should mention that each era deck has about 20% or 30% more cards than can possibly be dealt out. Meaning, if you play all seven, if you get all seven cards out twice, there's many more cards in the turmoil deck than you will possibly see in any given game. So there's definitely going to be some games where you'll never see some cards, or you'll see some cards you've seen before. You'll have to calculate whether you think of the event of the Tsar's abdication is good or bad for you. Or you have to calculate whether you think pushing for Red October is good or bad for you. There's a lot to think about in the game, but it's worth thinking through because ultimately the game can quite rewarding. I've had it play out where it was very historical. I've had it play out in completely unhistorical ways. And I'll also comment on game balance. I played for stretches where I was absolutely convinced that the revolutionary could not lose the game no matter how poorly they played. And then I played for long stretches where the government won every game. And it really depends on the player, the cards, the strategies chosen, and so on. So that's it. I really hope this helps you get into the game, give it a shot. And Mo, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this to potential revolutionaries or czarists.